Okay, this is going to stop me at 10 minutes, so let's see how we go. We're talking authorial intent, and we're talking Anna Funder and what it is that she's attempting to do throughout her collection of personal histories in Stasiland. So I thought I'd pose this as a couple of questions. So the first question is focusing around how does Funder order these stories and why does she chronicle her research in this way? And the second one's around how does her commentary influence the way in which these people's stories are represented. So to start with, I thought we could focus on Funder, and I haven't put in all the references. I'm going to talk you through those so you can examine those further. But as we've already noted, Funder positions herself as a kind of Alice in Wonderland investigator. So she's an outsider, somebody that is not familiar with the GDR, either post-GDR or pre-GDR. So her role in the story is both as an eyewitness, but as a character, a kind of character who stumbles into this land gone wrong and observes this horror romance post-GDR world play out through her daily interactions with people in the street, with people in the park, and then more obviously with the people that she encounters as she pursues these interviews with both victims and the Stasi men, informers, dictators, call them what you will. So I think you've firstly got to establish that she does position herself in a very deliberate way as the person who is presenting an objective reality, an objective truth, an objective history. So constant references to her Australianness, constant references to democracy and to the fact that when, for example, she encounters people like Herwins who want to know where her identity card is, and she says, we don't have identity cards in Australia, that establishes the benchmark for what normal is. So she's normal, and the GDR, both post and present, or post and pre, is kind of in a fluctuating state of insanity. So it's unreality versus the reality that she is framing her narrative against. So understand that. So she's presenting what is real, and her observations are therefore very much grounded in an objective truth. So she says, whilst what she observes, she comments on a kind of distorted world that is really weird and really disturbing and really confusing. And so for her, as she's kind of orienting herself in this environment, this strange environment, there's a number of things that become quite evident that she does that shows that she at times is also propelled into the realm of insanity. So try and note that even in the post-GDR climate, there is a culture that's fundamentally different to the culture that she is familiar with, and that is her kind of framing reference for what normal is. So in the chapter, for example, around the swimming pool, when she does descend into a kind of craziness, we can see that she's trying to understand a world that's fundamentally different to any kind of experience that she's had before. So in that chapter, you will see that she encounters a swimming pool that has these kind of perverse rules that people are meant to somehow intuitively follow despite the chaos that reigns. So if you can kind of understand that as a bit of a symbol for the chaos and the craziness that is the GDR and was the GDR, you can see that Funder is smack bang in the middle of this, trying to make sense of it. Okay, so structurally, the whole text is framed around Funder being catapulted into this crazy Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. So understand that. So the next bit then is how she sources her victims and her Stasi men and informers. So what does she do there? So she goes about obviously attempting to source information from people who are willing to talk. And I just thought this is an interesting kind of observation. If you break up the chapters into victims and perpetrators, Stasi men and informers, what you'll see is that I think there's actually more Stasi men, informers, dictators than there are victims. So that's kind of interesting, because you would assume that in compiling a reservoir of stories from people who have survived the GDR, you'd be more likely to find willing talkers, speakers, who were victims, who would want to talk about their story of having survived this fairly reprehensible regime. However, when you think about it, we've only got three. We've only got Julia, Miriam, and Frau Paul. And Julia lives next door to Anna. Miriam, she encounters through her outing at the Runday Eck, and she's given the name of Miriam, and she goes and pursues this character of Miriam, who she finds out climbed the wall when she was 16, and she's also the young woman who marries Charlie, who dies in prison. And so there's a number of layers to Miriam's story. And then, of course, we've got Frau Paul, whose son Torsten is sick in West Berlin, and she ends up being accused of harbouring people who were trying to flee, dissidents, and she's jailed for 4 years in Hoschenstoff prison, or whatever it's called. So they're really the face of the victims in the whole narrative. So I think that's interesting, because conversely, what we've got here in relation to the Stasi informers, the dictators, the Stasi men, all the collaborators who worked in various arms of the Stasi or within the SED party, you've got these stories. And socialist man Hagen Kosch, he kind of vacillates between victim and Stasi collaborator, having been the primary cartographer for drawing the map of the Berlin Wall when he was a very young man, and then resisting the very autocratic, dictatorial nature of the job that he had to do. But finally, kind of exercising a strained nostalgic loyalty to the regime down the track when Funder encounters him again in 2000 after she'd interviewed him in 1996, and he's doing tours of the wall. So there's kind of a weird kind of vacillating role that Hagen Kosch plays between somebody who was very much victimised by the regime, but who nonetheless in many ways is a defender of it. Then we've got Hurwins, who works in the area of counter-espionage. We've got von Schnitzler, who is the face of the Black Channel, and he's quite a menacing man who speaks in a very agitated, angry manner when Funder attempts to challenge some of his theories about socialism and its inevitable demise. Then we've got Her Christian, and he worked at pulling up stowaways who were attempting to flee the wall, and he would take them from their cars, and he was disguised, so he worked as an informer who was in incognito. And then we've got Herr Bock of Gom, who taught the science of recruiting at the university, and he's that very menacing character towards the end of the text, page 195, who Funder can't wait to get away from. And then we've got Herr Bosnack, and I haven't gone back and had a good look at his story, but he was a lieutenant colonel, and he worked in one of the most secret divisions of the Overseas Spy Service. He outed himself, so he's the only one really out of all of the dictators who was prepared to kind of go against what his original views were. We're almost running out of time, and I have got nowhere near into what it was that I wanted to talk about. But you can see in terms of organisationally, it's interesting that the Stasi men and informers become really quite prevalent within the collection. And that is